From Brexit poster boy to Prime Minister, Boris Johnson takes the keys to 10 Downing Street. But can he get the government's house in order? I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is Britain's new leader. The next 3 months will likely define Boris Johnson's leadership. On October the 31st, the UK is scheduled to leave the European Union, and Britain's Prime Minister needs to figure out how he's going to do it. It won't be easy. His party is divided. They have no majority in Parliament, and several political heavyweights have resigned, refusing to work with him. Johnson's tough stance on Brexit is what many believe won him the Tory leadership. But his do-or-die approach has created a massive split in the party. Rebel Conservative MPs have warned the new Prime Minister to ditch his no-deal agenda or face a fight to hold on to power. But this is a job he's coveted for years. Now that he has it, what will he do to hold on to it? That debate in a moment. But first, here's the moment Boris Johnson fulfilled a lifelong dream.
Boris Johnson is elected as the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party.
Like some slumbering giant, we are going to rise and ping off the guy ropes of self-doubt and negativity. With better education, better infrastructure, more police, fantastic full fibre broadband sprouting in every household, we are going to unite this amazing country and we are going to take it forward. I thank you all very much.
The ayes to the right, 315. The noes to the left, 274.
The United Kingdom reached an agreement with the European Union, and the European Union will stick to that agreement.
Well, let's go to our panel. In Malmö, Sweden, is former Conservative MEP Sajjad Karim. Andrew Allison joins us from Hull in the UK. He's the head of campaigns for the Freedom Association, a group which says it fights for individual liberty, freedom of expression and national sovereignty. And political analyst Tom Gross joins us from Tel Aviv. He's a former colleague of Boris Johnson. Good to have you all on the programme. I'm going to start with the same question for every one of you. Sajjad Karim, is Boris Johnson the person that the country needs right now as Prime Minister?
Well, I certainly, as a Brit, wish him well in his endeavours. The biggest question facing the United Kingdom today is how do we finalise this whole Brexit situation? I hope he has a very detailed plan in hand. This idea of simply being able to bulldoze your way through based purely upon sheer strength of spirit, I'm afraid, is not going to cut the mustard. It will be as successful as a bull in a china shop. What is required here is a very detailed plan and the carrying out of that plan in a very forensic manner, and I wish him well in that endeavour. OK,
you wish him well, but short answer, no. Andrew Allison, is he the man that the country needs?
I think he is the man that the country needs now. I couldn't think of anybody else. I certainly couldn't have supported Jeremy Hunt if I had been a member of the Conservative Party and had a vote. I mean, Jeremy Hunt accused Boris Johnson of peddling optimism. Well, my goodness me, I think we need some optimism now. The whole country is absolutely sick to death of Brexit and really want this over and done with. And I think if anyone's going to do it, then Boris is.
But you can't just motivate yourself out of it, right? I mean, when I'm looking at some of the stuff that he said as well, we need a new spirit of can-do. We're once again going to believe in ourselves and what we can achieve. And like some slumbering giant, we're going to rise and ping off the guy ropes of self-doubt and negativity. It sounds like a speech that a football coach would give an under-15 team, right? I mean, there's nothing about details, nothing about finesse, nothing about what he wants to do.
I think that's a little bit unfair. I mean, it's an under-15 team. But look, we do need a little bit more optimism. Boris is going to have to renegotiate with the European Union. And the European Union is going to have to move a little bit, and we're going to have to move a little bit if we are going to leave on the 31st of October. But I don't believe for one moment that the new European Commission president, or indeed the Council president, is going to want the UK hanging around much longer than the 31st of October, because they want to get on with their jobs.
Tom Gross, is he the right man for the job?
Well, I think we really don't know. I mean, I would agree up to a point with both your previous guests. We certainly need some optimism. There's nothing wrong with optimism. But the first guest who mentioned detail, I'm not sure that's Boris's strongest point. He really has to hit the ground running. We have less than 100 days until his self-imposed deadline, or rather the EU's deadline of October 31st to carry out Brexit, which he says he wants to do by then. We're entering the summer holiday period. Parliament in the UK is about to go into recess, and of course much of the people in France and Germany take the whole of August off. So I've known Boris Johnson since I was a teenager. I don't really believe that politicians change their personalities when they come into power, when they become Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. And although Boris is a celebrity and he's certainly amusing and good television and so on, Britain is at a very, very serious juncture in its modern history. And I just don't know whether Boris has the right temperament for such a serious point in British history.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that people's personalities don't change. Andrew Allison, one of the criticisms of Boris Johnson is similar to the criticisms of Donald Trump, where they say that for everything that Trump says, there's a tweet where he says the opposite in the past. For Boris, it's a column, right? In 2007, when Gordon Brown became Prime Minister, he said, it's the arrogance, it's the contempt. That's what gets me. It's Gordon Brown's apparent belief that he can just trample on the democratic will of the British people. They voted for Tony, and yet they now get Gordon, and a transition about as democratically proper as the transition from Claudius to Nero. It's a scandal. Why are we all conniving in this stitch-up? This is nothing less than a palace coup. So, we had Boris Johnson calling for fresh elections back then. So, he's definitely not going to call for fresh elections now, is he?
Well, there are two issues here. I mean, every time a Prime Minister changes and there isn't a general election, the opposition always calls for a general election. And yes, Boris said that in 2007 about Gordon Brown. And I'm sure that there were Labour politicians back in 2016 who said there should have been a general election immediately after Theresa May took office. But the second point to remember is that we are a parliamentary democracy. We do not elect a Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is appointed by the Queen, and what the Prime Minister has to do is assure the Queen that he or she can command a majority in the House of Commons. And if they can do that, then they get on with the job. And that's an important thing to remember.
I want all of us to have a little listen to Rory Stewart, and then Sajjad, I've got a question for you off the back of it. But let's have a little listen to what Tory frontrunner initially, who then bowed out of the race when he wasn't going to get enough votes, Rory Stewart. Let's have a little listen to what he said about Boris Johnson being potentially dangerous.
I think he's just... I think the danger is the lack of detail, the lack of anything particular. It's the sort of vagueness, the abstraction, the blandness of it that worries me. I literally don't know what happens on the 31st of October, the 1st of November. I can't plot his path. I mean, my mind works by trying to sort of do a little decision tree and think, I don't see how he gets no deals through Parliament. I don't see how he can deliver something that can simultaneously please Amber Rudd and Marc Francois. I don't get it. So, I mean, he's not dangerous in the sense that he's some kind of 1930s figure. It's just that I just don't get him. I mean, he's just not my kind of person. I don't understand how this works.
So, Sajjad Karim, we've had Rory Stewart quit. He doesn't want to work under Boris. We've had Philip Hammond quitting as Chancellor. They're calling them the rebels. Are you more in line with the rebels than you are with Boris Johnson? What would they create as an alternative?
Well, actually, I think what my colleagues have done here is cleared the way so that Boris can get on with forming a team of his own that actually believes that they can deliver this project in the way that Boris, I hope, will be setting out later, or certainly in a short while, to the British people and to our European family for them to see as well. So what they've done is they've cleared the way. He can get on with getting people in who believe what he believes, and that together they can get on with trying to deliver that particular agenda. The one point I will come back to is the requirement for attention to detail. And the one thing about Boris Johnson's past is a very clear demonstration that that has been lacking before. And I sincerely, speaking as a Brit, speaking as a member of the Conservative Party, speaking as somebody who's served as a parliamentarian, a Conservative parliamentarian, and somebody who cares deeply about the unity of the United Kingdom, I sincerely hope that Boris is going to take a very different approach. Not the same carelessness to detail that we've seen from him in previous roles, but actually somebody who adapts to the greatest office that the United Kingdom has for an elected politician.
Andrew Allison, what's his magic plan then? Because we've heard very little about, okay, what are you going to do about the Irish backstop? What are you going to do about the border? What are you going to do about all these myriad issues that are massive right now and will become even bigger on October the 31st. At the moment, we're hearing a lot of motivational talk, as we mentioned earlier. Does he have a plan?
Well, I would imagine that he does have a plan, but, you know, the man hasn't even become Prime Minister yet. He
was
will be
running
in
for
about
Prime
an hour
Minister.
or so's time.
Certainly, but he was running for Prime Minister.
Well, he was running for Prime Minister.
He had an opportunity.
But he's running for Prime.
Yeah, he had an opportunity to express his views, right? Yeah.
Well, yes, I do agree with you there. I also agree there with the previous speaker that Boris Johnson, you know, does have to get around the detail a lot more. I mean, his time in as Mayor of London, he had a lot of able deputies around him who used to do a lot of the heavy lifting. He got the credit for it, but it was them that were doing the work. And I really hope that he's got an excellent team around him, and we'll certainly find that out in the next few days. That will be full of details. But I do accept that he has been vague so far. I mean, I think you have to.
So Tom Gross is somebody who's known him for a long, long time. He's an Eton boy. He's an Oxford boy. He's got this mumbly, flabby, sloppy irreverence, which sometimes seems almost carefully crafted, right? And even though he said stuff about Donald Trump in the past, Donald Trump has chimed in. Donald Trump said he's tough and he's smart. They're calling him Britain Trump. That's what he tweeted. And people are saying that's a good thing. They like me over there. So Trump made it about himself. With all of that in mind, tell me about what the symbolism for the UK and its standing. Tell me what all of that means and represents with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, knowing the man.
Well, I do think there are some similarities between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. They both became known on television, in Trump, The Apprentice, in Boris Johnson, Have I Got News for You? And they both are very ambitious, more than policy-oriented. I think he raises the profile of Britain in the sense that people know him by his first name, Boris, not just in Britain, but increasingly internationally. How many politicians in the world are known by their first name? Usually that's just reserved for pop stars like Madonna or Beyonce or something. So in that sense, I think he'll become a well-known, better than, say, Theresa May, a well-known figurehead around the world. But is that good for Britain? I don't know. Donald Trump is a very well-known household name, but it doesn't mean that's necessarily good for America or America's standing. So, look, Boris Johnson is more intelligent than Donald Trump. As you say, he actually got a scholarship to Eton. He did well at Oxford. He was president of the Oxford Union. When I arrived at Oxford, he was older than me, but he was already a celebrity there among students. As the president of the union, he was a celebrity when he was a journalist. We both worked at the Telegraph for a while, and he stood out from practically every other journalist at the Telegraph as a amusing character, a larger-than-life character. He's certainly funny and makes people laugh. But are these the qualities necessary for any prime minister, especially at this this juncture in time, which is just critical for Britain. Yesterday he said he wanted to both unite Britain and deliver Brexit. I don't know how that's possible, because the country is very, very divided over Brexit.
Right. Okay, Tom, I thank you very much for joining us from Tel Aviv. Let's say goodbye to Tom and bring in Azim Ibrahim in Washington, D.C. He was a Labour Party policy advisor and is now a research professor at the Strategic Studies Institute at the U.S. Army War College. Azim, straight off the bat, Boris Johnson, is he the right man for the job?
Well, the only job that he has to do is deliver Brexit, and for that I believe he's probably the only man for the job. It seems absolutely clear that the team that he's putting together is purely a Brexit team. We've seen lots of resignations so far, even just today. All the Remain members of Parliament and members of the Cabinet are now leaving the stage, and he is composing a team that's going to be composed completely of Leave politicians. And that's actually very important, because the Leavers now have to own this entire show, and if he is not able to deliver Brexit by the 31st of October, or at least have a firm date by the 31st of October when they're actually leaving, then his premiership will be a failure. So he has to own this, and all the people around him that were part of the Leave campaign all have to now own this.
Right. Sajjad Karim, 3 years on, Brexit has become this beast that seems to feed on the flesh of Tory politicians, and the leaders end up not leading anymore. David Cameron, Theresa May. What's to guarantee that Boris Johnson's going to last at all, even maybe up until October 31st?
Well, there are never any guarantees in politics, but this particular scenario is really unique in so many different ways. And Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, really has the clock ticking away, and against him. There's no time for a honeymoon period, which normally national leaders are afforded. He's going to have to get straight at his desk and set out, as I say, in detail, the plan to get us to October the 31st and the delivery of a Brexit on an agreed basis deal with the European Union. This idea that without a deal, Britain is going to be able to leave on the 31st of October on the Prime Minister's say-so without a deal, I'm afraid, is not going to come to fruition. And what we will see at that particular point is a political crisis, but potentially a constitutional crisis, the end result of which will most likely be a general election after this government has fallen.
Yeah,
and so Boris Johnson really has a very limited amount of time available to him now.
Yeah, you say it's not going to come to fruition. He doesn't seem to agree, or doesn't seem to mind. Is he just playing politics by gambling with his words, or does he actually maybe believe that?
Well, one has to deal with realities, and the reality is that the numbers in Parliament simply are not there to allow a no-deal Brexit to proceed. And whilst, of course, it is in the executive power of the Prime Minister, based upon the fact that he just has to sit back and allow midnight of October the 31st to come, and it will happen automatically, but we still have a parliamentary democracy, and our Parliament will take steps to ensure that a no-deal Brexit is averted, and if those attempts are not succeeding, then the Parliament has the power to bring the government down before that date is reached.
And Azim, if you were advising the Labour Party today, what would you tell them to do?
Well, the Labour Party is in a very, very difficult situation. I don't think there's much that they can do. Much of it is essentially just down to Boris Johnson and trying to deliver. If he does not deliver, as your previous guest says, I suspect that there will be a general election. Boris Johnson will go to the country, and in that situation I suspect he will do a deal with Nigel Farage. He will probably give him a peerage and offer him a seat at the negotiating table to try to push through his Brexit. And in such a situation, if a general election is called, I suspect the Labour Party would probably be wiped out.
Andrew Allison, do European leaders take him seriously enough? Do they have the respect for the new Prime Minister that he probably deserves?
Well, they're going to have to start taking him seriously. I mean, as has been previously mentioned, Europe shuts down, or the EU shuts down for the whole of August, but so officially no negotiations can be done. But I would imagine that Boris will embark on some shuttle diplomacy. He's going to get around various capitals, speaks to different heads of government and heads of state, and try to get things moving. There has to be some sort of resolution to this. We voted to leave the European Union over 3 years ago. People expected it done and dusted by now. And although all the other European Union leaders do not want us to leave, they would much prefer us to stay. If we are going to go, they want it done, and they want to move on to their other projects.
Right. Sajjad Karim, Boris was, and it's worth emphasizing, miles ahead of Jeremy Hunt when it came to the voting within the party for the leadership. You had conversations with your fellow European MEPs in Brussels over the years. Undoubtedly, you would have spoken about Boris Johnson. How do they feel about him?
Well, the reality of the matter is that our European counterparts have got to deal with whoever the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is. Now, we have a new dynamic that has emerged. This is a very different personality, and personality actually does matter when it comes to the crunch, because when it comes to the detailed technical analysis of what we're dealing with, well, we've completed 98% of that. The remaining 2% now is political calculations that need to be signed off on. The problem that we have got here is that the withdrawal agreement is not going to be reopened. We need to be absolutely clear about that. The written agreement which accompanies the final text, however, there is room for manoeuvre in relation to that. But what we need here is an acceptance by the United Kingdom that Brexit has got to be a graduated process on a step-by-step approach. Otherwise, it's going to be an attempt to do it on a very abrupt basis, which will affect our economy in negative terms. It can be argued as to how negative, but it will be negative. And that is not something that the British Parliament will accept. So the reality of the situation is this: we need a deal. It needs to be accepted by the British Parliament that this is a graduated process that is going to take some time to deliver, and we've just got to work with that if we are to achieve a final Brexit point.
So, Azim Ibrahim, Boris assembles a Brexit-oriented cabinet. He pushes for Brexit to finally materialise before October the 31st. It happens. Britain doesn't crash out of Europe before October the 31st or on October the 31st. It actually happens. And the net result of that is what? Britain becoming more divided, right?
Not at all. I believe if Boris Johnson delivers Brexit, I think what will most likely happen, and I actually believe that the most likely scenario is actually just Theresa May's previous negotiated agreement, which will be tinkered with, and it will be passed off as a huge success of Boris Johnson. I think that's probably the most likely scenario. If I was Boris Johnson at the moment, I would be asking the new Chancellor to prepare for a no-deal Brexit of a massive package as a negotiating tactic with the EU to indicate that you're serious. If he delivers Brexit in any form, whichever it comes, the Conservative Party will be forced to come together, because Brexit, the European Union, is what has divided them for decades, and the party will then come together, and I believe it will then become a formidable political force in the UK. And I believe when Boris Johnson, the wise thing for him to do is to have a vision and an agenda already prepared for post-Brexit Britain, and then call a general election immediately, going on the euphoria of having delivered it and a vision for the country. And in such a situation, I think the Labour Party, if it's still led by Jeremy Corbyn, will be in very big trouble.
Sajjad Karim, tell me why you're shaking your head in disagreement.
It's in relation to this point that is still being made, that somehow the United Kingdom needs to convince the European Union that it is serious about a no-deal Brexit. I can tell you, the European Union is ready for a no-deal Brexit. It is a lose-lose situation on both sides for the UK and the remaining EU of 27. However, they are in a position to better able deal with the effects because they are spread out right across various parts of the economy in very many member states. So this idea that convincing them that we are willing to leave without a deal is something that is going to help the negotiations, it is not. It will have the opposite effect. And I want to remind everybody in the United Kingdom of what Michel Barnier said only a matter of days ago, that you can no-deal Brexit if you want to, but then be ready to deal with the consequences of that. Europe is ready. Are we ready? We may prepare ourselves, but it is not going to gain us any negotiating space by going to the table and threatening once again a no-deal Brexit. Europe is simply now at a point where it's saying, OK, go for it, but be ready.
Andrew Allison, are you ready for what appear to be the ominous consequences of a no-deal Brexit?
Oh, we hear all these different horror stories. We heard them during the referendum campaign. If we have to leave trading under WTO rules, there'll probably be a bumpy time, and I'm sure that we'll get over it. But just going back to sort of the previous comments there, the EU never ever believed that Theresa May was serious about leaving without a deal. It was so obvious. She conceded just about every negotiation. She conceded ground constantly, right from the beginning. She let the EU dictate terms, and we are where we are.
But she didn't want to impoverish her country. That's why, Andrew.
Oh, well, that's such a loaded question. I'm not even going to answer it. Going back to what Azim said, though, I do agree with much as what he had to say. I think it'll be tinkered. The current draft treaty will be tinkered around a little bit. The EU will be seen to be giving a little bit of ground. Boris will say, well, I've had to compromise just a little bit here to get where we are. It'll be repackaged. It will be a great triumph. The country will be saying, for goodness sake, please go for it, because we're absolutely sick and tired of Brexit now. And it will get through the House of Commons, and then life will move on.
OK, Andrew, the internet never forgets. So we're going to revisit this clip sometime soon down the line. OK, we're going to hold you to this. OK, well, Andrew Allison, Sajjad Karim, and Azim Ibrahim, I thank you all for joining us here on The Newsmakers. One of the most powerful and dangerous drug lords in history was sentenced to life behind bars last week. Joaquin Guzman, nicknamed El Chapo, brought billions of dollars of narcotics into the United States over the past 30 years. It reportedly made him one of the richest men in the world. But putting El Chapo away hasn't been cheap. In fact, it's cost millions. And despite his conviction, his Mexican cartel is still thriving. Every year, the U.S. spends $50 billion waging its war on drugs. But is it worth it? That debate in a moment. But first, Adam Pletz has this report.
Drug lord, fugitive, most wanted man, and now convicted criminal. In 2017, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was extradited to the US, and in February was found guilty of drug, weapons, and money laundering charges. Last Thursday, the notorious Mexican drug trafficker was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, plus 30 years.
This sentence is significant, and it is well deserved. It means that never again will Guzman pour poison over our borders, making billions while innocent lives are lost to drug violence and drug addiction.
The former leader of the Sinaloa cartel twice escaped prisons in Mexico, on the second occasion through a tunnel dug into his cell. He is now incarcerated in Colorado's maximum security penitentiary, known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, putting his chances of ever walking free firmly in the hands of his lawyer, who has said he will seek a retrial.
This case was simply an inquisition. It was a show trial. All that mattered was the government's evidence, no matter how flawed it may have been, no matter how many lunatics and sociopaths and psychopaths that it depended on. All that mattered was the evidence, and the jury be damned.
When asked whether El Chapo's sentencing would lead to increased gang violence, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador claimed otherwise.
No, al contrario, pensamos que poco a poco vamos a ir bajando la incidencia delictiva.
But Mexico's drug-related violence has soared since El Chapo was arrested, reaching record levels so far in 2019. And the Sinaloa cartel is reportedly as strong as ever, as is the demand for narcotics. Since US President Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs in 1971, the US has spent roughly $50 billion a year fighting drug traffickers. But American citizens pay those same traffickers more than $100 billion each year to satisfy their drug addiction. With such vast sums of money to be made, El Chapo's prosecution may serve as scant deterrence to other traffickers. By many estimates, catching El Chapo alone cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Money that some argue could perhaps have been better spent fighting the root causes of drug abuse. Adam Pletz, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now in Mexico City is Oswaldo Zavala. He's a journalist and author of the book, The Cartels Do Not Exist. Mike Vigil is the Chief of International Operations for the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA. And in Washington, D.C. is Malcolm Beath. He's the author of The Last Narco, Inside the Hunt for El Chapo, the world's most wanted drug lord. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us on The Newsmakers. Oswaldo, let me start with you. Life plus 30 for El Chapo. Is that fair sentencing?
Well, I believe the prosecution was successful enough to prove that El Chapo was, of course, a trafficker, an important one in the history of Mexico. But, I believe there are many contradictions in what went on in the trial that, at least from the Mexican side, seem rather unanswered. And the sentencing for many people, of course, seems fair, life in prison, perhaps for a man of that level of criminality. But there are many questions pending for us, in particular, especially about the money. So where is the money? Nobody has been able so far to find any money connected to this man. And I believe there's the pending task on the U.S. and the Mexican side to prove to what real extent did his criminal enterprise reach. At some point they told us that his criminal organization reached to over 50 countries in the world, and yet there's very little money to his name. Right. So I believe the biggest question is whether this man is really a myth or not.
Right. Mike Vigil, I'm assuming you're happy that El Chapo is going to spend the rest of his life in jail. But when we look a bit deeper, when we see that Sinaloa's still making money, the trafficking still continuing, does it seem like a waste of time just taking down the man when the system is far more powerful?
No, I think that Chapo Guzman needed to be put under the rule of law, and it is a great moral victory in that regard. Chapo Guzman was responsible for a lot of violence in Mexico that led to the deaths of probably over 200,000 people. That doesn't include the murders and the drug overdose deaths that were incurred here in the United States and in other foreign countries. Yes, we need to do more in terms of dismantling the Sinaloa cartel. The Sinaloa cartel continues to be very powerful in Mexico, and they do operate in over 40 countries around the world. But the United States is the primary focus of drugs coming from Chapo Guzman's cartel.
Right. Malcolm Beath, El Chapo, the highest profile kingpin, probably pretty much since Pablo Escobar, that's been taken down. The fact that he was seen as untouchable, that you could even lock him up and the next morning he'll disappear. That's how powerful this man was. And yet now that myth seems to have been busted, or maybe we should give him a few months to test it in the Supermax in Colorado. But the fact that he's been taken down, is it more symbolic or is it also tangible in addition to the symbolism?
I think it's very tangible. It's hard to resist being a sort of negative, sitting there criticizing U.S. policy and saying the drug war has failed. But the truth is that the fact that Chapo Guzman, a man of his stature, of his power, of his criminality, was extradited, faced trial, lost his case. The U.S. government proved their case clearly, without a shadow of a doubt. The fact that, you know, he could have been gunned down by Mexican Marines or by rivals or by police in Mexico and not face justice. The fact that, even though it may have cost taxpayers a lot of money, the fact that he was brought to Brooklyn, faced trial there, and convicted is a great win for what I would call, I mean, U.S. operations abroad. As Mike and other DEA folks like to tell me, the DEA is on the front line of the war on terror, overseas contingency operations. That means the checks and balances of the courts are being used against, you know, the possibility of abuse of force.
Right.
But and Malcolm, it's a great victory. It's
right,
not
but
just
Malcolm,
symbolic.
The fact that it's business as usual for Sinaloa and the other cartels. He's been replaced at the very top. It's like, okay, you get rid of the CEO, there's a new CEO, and everything keeps on flowing as it was. Doesn't that depress you?
Absolutely. And we know that it will keep flowing as it was. I saw some positive signs when I was researching my book, The Last Narco, back in 2010, 2012, after that, where the holes were being punctured in the hierarchy. Those were some positive signs. The mess that we have today, you know, DEA and former DEA like Mike like to talk about how the sons are, you know, have no chance of controlling the empire. That's most likely true, but of course someone will step in. Right. Yes, it's depressing, but it's not futile.
Right. Oswaldo Zavala, in the El Chapo-sized vacuum, what's it like? How have things changed? Have things become more chaotic among the cartels, within the cartels? How has it changed on the ground since he's been in the U.S. on trial and now he's been convicted?
Well, you know, that is a very good question, because ever since his capture and now that we've seen this process unfold, of course, the news was well received, and there's a lot of questions for us pending, you know, when the trial ended. But there's very little information that we can really hold to account and verify. After he was captured and extradited, we were expecting, we were told that a lot of violence would ensue. And of course, there's been violence, but it's very difficult to really understand how much really comes from the cartels, the so-called cartels, and how much is it really the result of the militarization in Mexico that started in 2007. And this is perhaps the main point here that I want to make today, that a lot of what we say and what we think we know about drug cartels, and especially about El Chapo, comes from official sources. And most of it is very unverifiable. It is very, very difficult for us as journalists to accept that this man really held the monopoly of cocaine in the hemisphere. And yet he was captured rather easily after this very strange interview with Sean Penn, and then brought to justice with such a strong case from the U.S. side. And yet we're still waiting to see how much of this really is real. You know? And yet, you know, we keep talking about him as if somehow he's still the mastermind, world-class trafficker. And yet he is just a common criminal already sentenced and en route to spend his life in prison.
Okay, so Mike Vigil, do you have any doubts about the gravitas of the man? Oh, yes, we know he trafficked coke and heroin and synthetics and weed and so on. And his cartel did a lot of gruesome, ghastly things, which they continue to do. But perhaps, as was suggested by Oswaldo, perhaps he wasn't as important as he's made out to be? Do you think that that's valid?
No, that is not valid. The fact of the matter is that Chapo Guzman was probably the biggest drug lord in the history of the world. Now, during the time that he's been in jail, the cartel has been run by Ismael Zambada, and the power behind the Sinaloa cartel is unlike most criminal organizations that have a vertical structure. The Sinaloa cartel has a horizontal structure, so the line for decision-making authority runs across the entire network. But make no mistake about it, Chapo Guzman was a very, very powerful criminal. And what got Chapo Guzman caught is the fact that he came down from the mountains, to initially to Culiacan, then fled to Mazatlán, where he was captured, and then he was captured again in a shootout in Los Mochis. So Chapo Guzman, had he stayed up in the mountains, in the Sierra Madre Mountains, would probably still be a free man. But Mayo Zambada is a little bit more cunning, a little bit more astute. He has never stepped inside a jail cell because he remains up in the mountains. Chapo Guzman is a tremendous criminal that has done untold damage to Mexico and to the United States.
So, Mike, there's the bigger question of solving the drug war, which has taken tens of thousands of lives and is a horrendous stain on the Americas right now. But do you truly believe that crime by crime, criminal by criminal, if you chip away and you make these small, you have these tiny little wins, you're going to make some sort of dent against the cartels?
I think that we need to do a better job here in the United States in terms of curbing demand and consumption, because as long as we have the consumption here in the United States, if it's not Chapo Guzman, it's not Pablo Escobar, it's going to be somebody else. It's the basic law of economics, supply and demand, and we need to do a tremendous job here in the United States, because people talk about, the war on drugs. We should declare the war on demand, and our politicians have to do a better job. The families have to do a better job in terms of educating their children, the religious institutions, the schools. So without the reduction in demand, there's always going to be somebody else that is going to fill that void. It's kind of like the balloon effect. You squeeze in one area and it filters out into other areas.
Right. So, Oswaldo, is the belief that for as long as American veins and nostrils keep on demanding this stuff, you can never truly make a difference by capturing someone and sentencing someone like El Chapo?
Well, I believe that, of course, the drug war must end. I think it historically is proven wrong, that it's not only failing at stopping the drug trade among the two countries and the entire hemisphere, but also the problem that the militarization in Mexico brought itself most of the violence. When you compare the figures of what were Mexican society homicide indexes before the militarization, it is often forgotten that right up to 2007, we actually had one of the most peaceful decades in Mexico. The homicide rate was actually declining, and it only spiked, it only surged right after the militarization in 2007, and then it spiraled out of control as these military tasks continued all over the country. I feel that the question is not just about the drug war and the drug trade itself, but the militarization efforts in our hemisphere, and in particular in our country, that is damaging Mexican society.
Right, and let me ask Malcolm about that, because this is a point that's often brought up, the militarized response to this as well, which in a way feeds the drug war instead of solving it. We see the violence of the cartels. It's grotesque, it's gruesome. Chopping off of heads, it's almost medieval, almost putting them on a pike outside the gates of the city, right? Do we have overreactions, whether it's from the Americans, the Mexicans, and that only begets more violence? Are they reacting to this in the wrong way?
I personally don't think militarization makes things worse. When I was reporting on the ground, that would be 2007 to 2010. That is a while ago, but these things sort of happen in patterns. I did find the military to be a welcome relief for most citizens. You have to understand, I think, that beyond just being drug cartels, what's going on is you have basically, it's a type of war. It's a simmering conflict, a small war, where the cartels have their own propaganda groups. They have They hang banners opposing the government. They spin propaganda. Osvaldo mentioned that the Mexican public is where may not have seen all the evidence it wanted to against Chapo Guzman. Well, that's because he's built up a mythology. The facts are there, but he's also built up a rumor mill around him, and the military combats that. But just by it's not just the actual military in the streets, patrols and raids. It's their presence which gives a sense of confidence. And I remember looking at polls nonstop throughout that period, and recent polls I've looked at too, but lest I don't follow it day to day. The polls consistently show that the military is hugely trusted by the public, whereas the federal police and the local police certainly don't have that confidence.
Okay, Malcolm, Mike, and Osvaldo, I thank you all sincerely for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Looking forward to having you back on the program. Now, to take a more historical perspective, let's talk to Alexander Avina. He's an associate professor of Latin American history with a focus on drug wars at Arizona State University. Alexander, good to have you on the program. In our previous segment, we spoke about Theresa May leaving and Boris Johnson becoming the next UK Prime Minister. It's kind of the same if you think about El Chapo going to jail for the rest of his life. Sinaloa carries on, doesn't it? It gets a new boss and it's business as usual, like a government or like a corporation. Is that because while the man has been taken down, the parameters of the game have been left unchanged, so there's no real fundamental change on the ground?
Yes, thank you for having me. Yeah, I completely agree, right? And I think this is a point that Osvaldo was making in the previous segment. This is the strategy of going after cartel leaders and extraditing them to the United States, which begins in the mid-1980s. I mean, this is not a new strategy. This is something that's been used since the mid to late 1980s, has not resulted in any tangible, verifiable results, right? Because as you correctly note, the structure remains in place while these drug kingpins are extradited to the United States. The political economy of narcotics and drugs continues to operate. Someone else simply takes the fallen kingpin's place, and business continues as usual. I think we need to step back and looking at the Chapo case from a historical perspective. We need to look at the structure, the political economy of narcotics. We cannot individualize a complex history and political economy by just focusing on El Chapo. If we do that, then a lot of people who are involved in this system are not held culpable or not held responsible for their role in perpetuating this. The drug war, in my opinion, is a war against poor people. And by focusing only on El Chapo, we let the system and individual actors off the hook.
Do you think that the Trump administration, that López Obrador, that Duque and others who are leading countries further south, all along that supply chain, do you think that they're asking these deeper questions about solving the fundamental root causes?
In general, no. I mean, I think there's definite differences. López Obrador, when he was campaigning to be president of Mexico, was talking about a new approach to drugs. He talked about legalization. He talks about hugs, not bullets, abrazos, no balazos. But in large part, he's continued the same militarization policy that his predecessors initiated, right? And you could also make the argument that he's amped this up by creating something called the Guardia Nacional, the National Guard, as another military force that will directly take on the problem of drug production and drug violence in Mexico. But the broader structure is left intact. These bigger questions are left unasked and, more importantly, unanswered. Something I think we need to take into consideration when we talk about Mexico is that these drug traffickers and these drug trafficking organizations do not emerge autonomously from the outside and then emerge to corrupt the Mexican government. If you look at the history of drug production and drug trafficking organizations in Mexico, these organizations emerge from within the confines of the Mexican state, particularly within its national security apparatuses like the military, the judicial police, and different political police apparatuses. That should be our starting point when we analyze how to solve this drug violence issue. That, and also taking into consideration, why are everyday people in the mountains of Mexico turning to the growing of marijuana and opium poppies as a way of making a livelihood?
Yeah, but very simply, would you accept that this is justice for somebody whose sibling OD'd on drugs that made it all the way up to the US through El Chapo's supply chain, or somebody whose son took a bullet to the head that was from the cartel. This man spending the rest of his life in Supermax prison is justice for those people affected.
Quite possibly. I think in a direct situation like that, then we could consider that it's a form of limited justice. But if we're looking at it from a broader perspective in terms of whether this is going to have a broader, meaningful, positive impact on the drug war, it's minimal. It's not. It's a negligible impact. But I can understand the perspective of someone who has a direct tie to this and feeling like they achieve some sort of justice.
Right. Alexander Avina, I'm out of time, but you've had some really good thoughts here, and I'd love to invite you back onto the program sometime soon. By the way, just before we go, that Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, these are some of the other inmates that El Chapo will be sharing the prison with. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber, Zacarias Moussaoui, September 11 conspirator, Unabomber Ted Kaczynski. Fascinating. I mean, in my mind, I'm thinking there's going to be a hell of a cafeteria at lunchtime, but presumably they're not going to sit together. Interesting times ahead. Looking forward to having you back.
If I can say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
And he's also going to, yes.
He's also what?
No, one other inmate is an Honduran trafficker by the name of Ballesteros, who was one of these really important traffickers that helped link Colombian to Mexican drug trafficking organizations in the 80s. So that should be fascinating as well.
Well, I hope they don't get together and come up with some big grand plan and then make calls outside and things get worse. But Alexander, looking forward to chatting to you soon. Thanks so much for joining us on the Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, we ask if Robert Mueller's testimony to the US Congress will lead to Donald Trump's impeachment. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.